There's a growing body of evidence that shows using nature as a form of resilient infrastructure is a sound investment. This is no ideological crusade. The effectiveness of nature to protect our environments and manage the impacts of climate change is proven. The questions to answer are how nature-led solutions work at scale, how they're financed, and how they're maintained over the long term. Helping us to unpick this fascinating subject, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Neil Entwistle, Head of Science with Rebalance Earth, an asset management specialist helping finance the restoration of nature, and Mike Morris, Technical Director in Stantec's water business. I'm Graham Munday. Welcome to The Scope, a podcast from Stantec, a global leader in sustainable engineering, architecture, and environmental consulting. Mike, thanks for joining us. From your position, working particularly in the water sector, can you give us some examples of what nature can achieve? What do we mean by nature-based or nature-led solutions?
So water utilities have been working with nature for decades. Projects like United Utilities SCAMP project, Sustainable Catchment Management Program, Southwest Water's Upstream Thinking, Severn Trent's STEPS program. SCAMP was looks largely at peatland restoration. The other two look at working with farmers, working on land before clean water gets to the asset, to their infrastructure. And the reason that they work in these areas is because there is a financial reason for doing so, cleaning the water before it gets to the asset. A lot of the work that we've done at Stantec in supporting those programs is to understand the benefits in terms of nutrient removal, in terms of water quality, and the financial benefits of those kind of programs. On the other side, from a wastewater perspective, you have a number of water companies. We've worked with Yorkshire Water, Northumbrian Water, just to name two, looking at integrated constructed wetlands. And integrated constructed wetlands are a really useful tool in terms of tertiary cleansing from wastewater treatment. You can use them as part of a surface water separation when it comes to storm overflows, for example, and flood risk mitigation. All of those aspects would not be used by water utilities if there was not a benefit to them, in particular around the regulatory requirements that they have to achieve, financial benefit. But they also provide wider benefits for the company in terms of reduction of carbon, in terms of embodied carbon, increased biodiversity. There are societal benefits as well. So there's lots of reasons why water utilities use nature-based solutions, and we're seeing an increase in the options for them.
Thank you. And Neil, thank you so much for joining us from Rebalance Earth. In terms of your organisation and the kind of clients and sectors you work in, give us a perspective from other areas of who else is investing in this area and thinking, yeah, nature is a great solution for us.
Thanks, Graham. So from our perspective, we're trying to use pension fund as the capital to put into these restoration projects at scale. And the reason that they would do that is because it impacts on some of their assets. So a bit like what Mike said in terms of the utilities, it's who else would benefit, who else has no longer a permission to operate, if that makes sense. So if you think about abstraction within that environment, when the water levels go low, you can't abstract, which means you don't have that business resilience anymore. You've also then got the other side of the drought element, which is the floods. And what happens if you get flooded? What happens if a road gets flooded or a rail gets flooded? And that's then no longer permission to operate because you can't. Or there's fines because of the disruption that's caused.
So infrastructure sector as a whole, if you like, and the various organisations that make it up find this a really valuable solution by the sounds of things, yes. And nature is almost a solution that it feels like it's hiding in plain sight. Would you agree?
Yeah. You want me to take that? I'll take that. So, I mean, this is the critical thing. We've often engineered the landscape that's caused the problems that we have. So if you think about it, that with probably every 10 foot, is it, Mike? Something like that, across our landscape, there's an underground pipe to drain that landscape. So we have access to that landscape. And that's an incredible feat of engineering that was done way before the first Ordnance Survey mapping took place. No, we've drained that landscape so that we can utilize that area. But the problem is that when the rain falls into that environment, it runs straight down the catchment, straight to where our assets are, and that's then the compounding problem that we have.
Yeah, but then we're using nature to now reverse that and to stop that and protect that.
Well, we're restoring the natural processes that nature has. This is the thing, you see. If you flip the switch and restore those natural processes, they become self-sustaining. And then that self-sustainability means that you have that longevity and you have that resilience within that landscape. But it's quite hard to put that back because it needs to be at the scale. And we've never had the scale before because we've not had the financing to be able to do that.
And one of the key elements around that as well is that nature is part of infrastructure, provides or performs a service that we rely on, whether it's a private company, government or society. And we're seeing a growing number of our clients who are starting to understand the risk from nature, whether it be water resource planning or flood risk or drought. And so when those risks become material to the company or to the government or to society, that's where that approach is absolutely key, because we can find the ability or understand the ability for the scale we need to reduce those risks.
Let's talk about how these schemes are financed. So the couple of stats: the government is targeting up to £1 billion a year of private finance into nature by 2030. And a study commissioned in 2025 by RSPB, National Trust, and the Wildlife Trust said up to £5.9 billion per year is required to fund nature-based solutions. So, Neil, this is the heart of your business that you're in. How are the type of schemes that you've both described, how are they financed?
Yeah, so if you take that entire catchment and look at it holistically, so this is everything from where the water would fall within that catchment. So the very top of that catchment, the peatland restoration, moorland restoration, through the link between the rivers and its floodplain as it moves down, through to the businesses that are at risk. So you have to look at it from an entire catchment perspective. So the financing goes into how you would restore that catchment to deal with the water where it falls. And then within each catchment, everywhere is different because of the geology and the aspect and the topography and that sort of thing. When you look at it from that big scale, you can see who would benefit and why. So we can put the capital in from the institutional fund that we have. And then the people who would rely on that, either through credits or contracts, would then return that investment that goes alongside the government incentives.
And can we explore the return on investment aspect a bit in terms of how do they achieve the return on investment?
Yeah, so the easiest way to explain that is credits or contracts, right? So it could be carbon credits, it could be biodiversity net gain, it could be things like nutrient neutrality, or it's contracts. So this might be through contracted payments for the resilience that company may have, or that permission to operate, or it could even be like because it offsets the fines that they would incur, things like that. So that's the easiest way to explain the return on the investment. But the nuance is going to be somewhat dependent on where you are in the country, simply because it will depend on geographically where you are and who is involved in the catchment.
You touched on pension funds earlier, and I'm actually just going to take us back to that, maybe for our audience as well. Just give us a sense of how much this is attracting the attention of the pension funds now. Earlier, you, to be fair, gave us an answer about why, but how much is it attracting the attention of the pension funds, this area?
Yeah, so there was a study in 2025 that pretty much collected how much was in the pension fund capital. So it's something like 3.4 trillion. So if you break that down, you've got gilts and bonds in terms of one element of investment, you've got infrastructure and equities, but then there's also an element of natural capital. So the percentage that goes into natural capital, if you say 2 to 5% of that element, that's going to rise to 100 billion in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a huge amount that would potentially be invested in this area. The reason why they would do that is because it's diversified. So it's away from stocks and shares. It's away from the volatility of the market, but it's also part of that natural capital that helps to provide the resilience to other elements within their portfolio, their investment portfolio, that might be at risk. And that might be supply chain, it might be infrastructure, it might be their own personal owned assets. So it's their diversification of their portfolio, and it's dependent upon, again, where they are in the country, because the pensions have been pooled geographically. So different pools will have different assets and assets at risk, and it's that element that is researched, and therefore, you can look at it and find out the answers and find out the resilience, find out the risk, and that's part of the investment.
Thank you. And Mike, again, you touched on this point earlier, but let's explore it a bit further. How, from your perspective, are we seeing clients, and admittedly they're probably from your perspective predominantly in the water sector, starting to see this as a viable option, and what is attracting them?
So again, it comes down to the question of what could nature do to either reduce a risk on the business model or the asset in question. From a water perspective, that has to meet regulatory requirement. It also has to look at trust within the customer base, the trust within the investment base. But the reality is that from a water utilities perspective, their main goals are to put clean water out of our taps and to take away sewage. If they can do that using nature-based solutions or natural solutions, where there are multiple benefits to them as a company, and there are also multiple benefits to us as a society and others within that catchment, and that's the critical point Neil made earlier about that scale that we now understand better, and we need to look at more in terms of how water utilities can benefit from this approach. And that has to be financial, it has to be regulatory requirement. But really, and excitingly for me, and the bit that I'm most interested in, is how can we bring multiple clients together in a geography, whether it's a catchment or a landscape, but normally a catchment, where they have multiple organizations, could be governments, could be private finance, could be society. They have increased flood risk. They're all looking for the same quality of water for different reasons, whether they're private businesses or water utilities companies, and how we can then bring that together and collaborate. And that integration of collaboration, weird sentence, but I think it works, is absolutely the way that this can only work, so that we can meet the requirements from climate change, economics, business, society, nature crisis, and water resources.
I feel like I might be putting you on the spot here, but do we have an example of that? I'm thinking in Manchester, this is integrated catchment management, isn't it?
That's exactly what it is. Yeah. So we were involved in the integrated water management plan in Manchester. We've been engaged with through United Utilities, the Environment Agency, and Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which I know Rebalance Earth are also involved in now. Similar concepts in Hull with Yorkshire Water, and we're working with other clients as well. As I say, I mean, Manchester's a good example because you have the government regulator, you have a private water company, and you have the local authority who saw a need to come together, and the opportunities from that are absolutely critical. Integrated catchment approach is simple in many respects in the fact that it's looking for multiple actors to work together to improve the water environment. It's complex in the fact that they've all have different objectives. And so the governance around that and how to manage that, that's the critical part. And that's the not easy part, but it's certainly achievable. And Manchester's a good example of how that's working.
And in these podcasts, we talk a lot about public and private partnerships, and this is a great example of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, and again, Neil's touched on the private finance, that the private investment will go alongside public investment. It will go alongside philanthropy. It'll go alongside other funding and finance. And that blended approach is also complex. But when it's done through the right reasons, with the right objectives, mission, vision, and everyone's pulling in the same direction, it can have a really positive impact.
Let's move on a little bit. Let's have a look at who needs some proof that this is a tangible solution at the appropriate time, as effective as an engineered solution. And for both of you, I'm going to look at some different audiences who need that proof point. So Mike, you've touched on them already, the regulators. How are the regulators, how is their mind put at rest that this is an appropriate solution?
So with any industry that's regulated, the company involved has to meet the requirements of that regulation. And if you look at water utilities, that could be a percentage reduction in nutrient loads in a river. It could be reduction in the number of incidents of storm overflow spills. To ensure that the regulator for the water utilities companies in the UK are concerned, they have to be confident that any solution, whether it's natural or engineering, will meet that regulation. And if they're not comfortable, they won't back it. So we've largely worked with engineering, hard engineering, concrete, chemical. But there's more assurance there. A lot of the work that's been going on over the last few decades, I suppose is probably the right number of years, is to look at the evidence base and the assurance that natural solutions will provide the same. And I think with the white paper that came out in January on the back of the Cunliffe report, we're seeing regulators start to be more trustworthy of that kind of approach.
And Neil, I'm going to give you the insurance sector and local authorities. How do we put their mind at rest?
Yeah, so following on from what Mike said, it's interesting because when you speak to an engineer, there's always this extra element of resilience that they add to it. So if you're having an I-beam in your house, they'll add a few percent onto the top just for resilience and insurance, just to make sure that it's enough. And that's the same as what you get with nature-based solutions, is that as they evolve over time, they become more resilient. When it comes to the insurance, a really good example is the wire NFM.
Yeah.
So that was a combination of United Utilities, the Environment Agency, the Wire Rivers Trust, Flood Re and insurance to provide that resilience to that area through nature-based solutions, through NFM. So the flip side of that is that Flood Re will come to an end at some point. 2039 is the initial date. And that's the point of trying to make sure that something remains insurable. With climate change, with cloudbursts, with these extreme rainfall events that we're receiving now, then the standard deviation and the extreme events are getting greater. The problem with that is that it means that the insurance risk is higher. And insurance is strange in so much as that if something is too risky, it's not insurable. And if it's and you need this balance. And how do you get that balance? Because if it's too risky, it's not insurable, which means then it's not mortgageable. So there's this risk that needs to be thought about. It needs to be considered, and it needs to be looked at a catchment scale again, because you get that resilience from the catchment scale approach rather than from a smaller scale intervention.
The interesting thing about the wire as well is that it was a starting point to see how this could work, and it's been picked up in other catchments. Severn Valley Water Management Scheme being an example of a broader geography, but it's based on some of the learning and understanding from the wire. And, we need to work at that kind of scale. The Severn in Wales covers a significant portion of Wales. And that cross-border nature is difficult, but interesting as well.
Yeah.
But a large proportion of that stemmed from the wire.
Well, that's it. And the wire was the pilot. Now what we have are further examples, which is why we don't use pilot. Yeah, I know, I agree. That was the pilot. Now that was the blueprint, and we move on from that, and we reuse that same learning again and again in different locations. Landscape recovery is a similar one.
Yeah.
And when we did a briefing call on this, we talked about pilots, didn't we? Let's just briefly talk about that now. How do we move from pilot to being scalable?
Pilots, we've done pilots. We've been working in nature-based solutions for 25 years, probably a bit more when you start to think about it. But we understand the science. We know that it works. All we're doing now is applying a different financial mechanism, putting it to scale. So I think the era of pilots is over. The evidence base is there. It's just scaling that evidence base with projects in different regions. So the danger is people keep referring back to pilots. We don't need to do that.
Yeah.
We know the science. Now what we're doing is using that initial blueprint into other areas, like the example Mike gave from the wire to the Severn.
The other issue, I have lots of issues with pilots, but the other issue with pilots is they embed silos.
Yeah.
So most pilots will look at how can you use nature for biodiversity or for water or for, as you've just said, we've moved past that. We understand now that at landscape or catchment scale, it is water and nature and society and mental health and physics. If we carry on doing pilots, we'll just continue to embed.
Yeah. Okay. No more pilots. Don't mention it. Let's move on to how these schemes are maintained over the long run, though. Who pays, who benefits, who gets a return on the investment. Neil, do you want to kick us off on that particular area? Long-term maintenance.
Yeah, I can do that. So let me do that as well as maintenance monitoring too.
Yep.
So coming from an academic background, one of the things that I did with a lot of restoration projects was provide some of the monitoring, because I was interested in how the river responded to that restoration. That was my sort of scientific remit. As an academic, I wanted to understand how the restoration would change that environment and how nature would be resilient depending on the interventions. That was never funded, which is why as an academic I did it just as through research or through embedding it in field trips so you could continue to go. When it comes to the financial instrument that we have now, monitoring, reporting, maintenance and verification are all part of the special purpose vehicle that's created around a project. So within the whole financial package, if you like, is part of the maintenance. And that maintenance can be done by the project itself. It could be done by the farmers. It could be done by the farming cluster that's part of the initial project. I'm afraid to say it depends, because it does depend on where you are, but it's all part of that package.
Heaven to my ears. I worked in the NGO community for so many years, and monitoring was always the first thing to get removed from the budget. Maintenance was always the second. And if we build a flood defense scheme using hard engineering, we'll maintain it. There's no reason why we shouldn't be maintaining nature restoration for whatever reason it is. So it needs to be embedded. And I think that MRV approach with the maintenance added onto it, I think is critical, absolutely critical.
Yeah, because effectively, when you have the hard engineering, it's part of your asset base.
Exactly.
So the nature-based solutions at the catchment scale is part of the asset that whoever is the corporate who's been the off-taker is part of their asset base, which is the argument around nature on the balance sheet.
Right. And Mike, I was going to say to you, in terms of the water clients that you work with and that Stantec works with as a business, this is an asset, isn't it? Again, it's another asset along with hard assets as well.
Absolutely. And Neil's taking the words out of my mouth. It ends up on the balance sheet. It has to. It's a risk management tool. And whether that risk is clean water, water resources, flood risk, it's an asset. And if we as companies, government, society don't treat it as such, we'll go back to where we were not that long ago.
And how are communities involved in these sorts of schemes as well, and understand why they are positive, why they've been brought into a particular area? How does that work?
It's a really interesting one. A lot of the river projects that I've been part of before are somewhat detracted from people, from communities. They don't have access. So there's an element that Mike mentioned before about that societal return on the investment. So it's nature prescribing. It's being able to get into nature and access that. There was a study by CIWEM, so the Chartered Institute of Water and Environmental Managers, that showed that good quality SUDs, so sustainable urban drainage systems, add a significant percentage to people's homes, to their assets. And that's the same if you're near a national park. Your house price can demand a higher value because of your access to nature. And it also then comes to the value of your asset in terms of its resilience to these extremes of nature. So from a societal perspective, from a community perspective, if something's good and functional, you tend to look after it. But as part of the special purpose vehicle, as part of the investment, there's money to ensure that that's maintained. And as part of the pension capital, they want to have this world that's worth living in. And it's a pension, it's your pension, it's my pension, it's our world that's worth living in, and it's investing in the areas that we work in and live in.
It's also, there's a couple of other elements which are critical. So as I mentioned, a large proportion of my career has been in working for charities, catchment-based approach partnerships. if you don't have the local community engaged with whatever work you're trying to do in nature, it misses something. And quite often that's ownership. And I don't mean, financial or risk ownership. I mean, engagement with the program. If you bring the community in at the right point, and they are part of that story because it's their community, then they'll engage more, they'll protect it more, and they'll work harder for that environmental improvement. And that could be through citizen science, which a recent Offshore Innovation Fund called CASCO, which was led by the Rivers Trust, has been looking at how to bring citizen science more into the monitoring conversation. Or it could be through maintenance, or it could be undertaking the practical action. But local communities are essential at all levels in terms of nature restoration.
And for our clients, that's a really important part of their engagement, isn't it? I'm assuming as well.
It'll depend on the client, and it'll depend on the need. But yes, absolutely. So again, looking at the water utility sectors, they're engaged with catchment-based approach partnerships in England. In Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland, they're slightly different, the way it works. But that engagement with society, landowners as part of the community, parish councils, local authorities, it's all part of that stakeholder engagement. And if they're not engaged, they're not being part of the story, then it doesn't work in the same way.
Before I get to our crystal ball question at the end, I just also want to capture that from a careers perspective in this area, this is fascinating for people who maybe want to come into this area, isn't it? In terms of its development and evolution.
100%. I think we're at a stage now, and I think the generation that's coming through school and university now, I would argue, have a better understanding of the need to undertake these kind of approaches. So, people who come to us for work experience, for example, are coming with that knowledge and understanding already. We still have a gap in terms of the skills and the knowledge. So again, Offshore Innovation Fund that's just finished mainstreaming nature-based solutions, and the daughter projects from that approach are looking at how we can bring nature-based solution skills across sectors, not just into water, but throughout infrastructure as well. That's essential. But I think part of that education is we need to speak the same language as well. Finance, hydrology, nature restoration, insurance, we don't talk the same way. That's got better during my career, but it's not there yet either. And I think if we can find ways that, again, this new generation can come through and really understand how to link those things together, we'll be fine.
Yeah. We need a pilot project, I would say.
No. Let me add to that. The other thing as well is that people come to these projects from their level of understanding. And if you think back in terms of generations, what amount of information were people aware of when they were going through their careers? So now the younger generation, the ones who are coming through universities now, have always had access to the internet and a wealth of information. Yeah. They see floods now that are happening all around the world within minutes of them actually happening. That's not the case in times gone by. We also assume that the river that's outside of our house is natural and normal. Again, that's not. And the more that people are made aware of that, the better their level of understanding is. And that, again, comes through the dissemination of the science, which then means that people then start talking the same language.
Yeah. Okay. Quick crystal ball moment as a wrap-up question to you both then. Given everything we talked about, where can technology and science, with funding, take nature-led solutions as infrastructure in the longer term? So let's look 20 years, maybe even 30 years from now.
Oh, crikey. Me first. I knew you'd do that. Yeah, thanks. Well, crikey, where would you start? I mean, you've only got to look back 5 years and AI wasn't really around in the way that it is mainstream now. So the technological evolution has been huge. And we're in the next sort of revolution of computer science and that level of understanding of what we can do. Backed by institutional capital, we can really turn the tide on the impact that is happening from climate change and what's happening on our own personal resilience within the country. I think that's huge. So where we will be in 20 years' time, we'll have we'll have turned the switch. I'm being positive. I'm a glass half full as it is. I want to have an environment where we are resilient to these extreme events, where our supply chain can continue even though there's an extreme event. I think we need to move away from this sort of mantra of we've got to manage we've got to have flood management. We need to have managed flooding. Flooding needs to occur in certain locations, and we don't want it to occur in other locations, but we're getting that amount of rainfall and we have to treat it where it falls, which is why we need the integrated water management, because that incorporates everything from the top of the catchment to the bottom. I could keep going for hours. I'm an academic, but I'll pass to Mike.
What he said. I think the only thing I would add is I'm fascinated and have been for the last few years about how engineering and the development of engineering and linked to that science and technology have changed the way that we work with the natural environment. So if you go back 50 years, but certainly hundreds of years, we were in tune with seasons, we were in tune with floods, and we would move with them and we would work with them. Now, in more recent times, we've pulled nature in, and we won't let it flood, and if it does, it's absolutely damaging. But engineering has developed, and we're now using those skills and knowledge that we created that pulling in to release. And I think science and technology will do the same. The key element to how they will help, and I'm also positive, I've got 3 young children, so I have to be, is that they will have a future where nature is embedded in everything that we do. So as science, technology, and engineering evolve and move forward, as long as we keep in mind that nature is a key part of the infrastructure of all of that, and that we have to protect nature as well as restore it, then those 3 technology, science, and engineering will help us to have a much better, resilient future for society in the next 20 years.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Thank you both. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. Mike, good to see you. Thank you for your contribution. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to The Scope on Apple or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find all of our episodes on the Stantec website.